So I'd like to begin the 2023 fall lecture series. Thank you all for joining us again. I when I put this together, um, there were actually about three people who said they were going to join, but I don't see them on on here. So and a lot of the first two sessions in particular was meant more for them than anything else, because uh, what I would like to get to is the Tanisho in particular, talking about. Oh, there's Sam. Hey, Sam. Good. So everybody else is online. Anywhere, it's fine. Well, I didn't light it, so yeah, I will next time. Sorry. Yeah, so we're here today for this lecture series, and ultimately, what I wanted to get to, and Michael had mentioned last time or last session that it would be nice to study the Tanisho, the Record in Lament of Divergence, which was written by a disciple of Shinran Shonin, Yu Yanbo. However, there there were some newer people, and before I get into Tanisho, which is very specific to Jodo Shinshu, I thought people need to know how this all developed. And so the first two sessions will be basically a review. And as I look on this Zoom cast, all of you have been regulars at the lectures, so perhaps you don't even need this review. But Sam is here for the first time. Mind you, Sam studied Eastern religion, so he probably doesn't need this review either, but we'll go through it anyways. But so this past Sunday, I read a passage from the collected works of Shinran. It was the introductory passage by the former Gomon Sama, and I sent it out to all of you. And it's talking about what perhaps could be the goal of this lecture series, and it is genuine to find the guidance for us by listening to the Dharma. And as I was reading this, I realized, first of all, that there's some things that you need to know. So, Mon Shu means literally, Mon is gate, Shu is the patron or the guardian of the gate. Okay, so Mon Shu literally means the guardian or patron of the gate. In this case, the gate of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And so Otani, Koshin was his first name. Otani is the last name. He was a former uh, Monshu for us. Now, the reason why it's called the patron or guardian of the gate is that, as you know, Buddhism has many, many different paths, and this is just one path. Um, Incidentally, as an aside, we are hopefully at some point we're thinking of building a gate in front of our temple, more of a symbolic gate than anything else. And this is very traditional in the temples throughout the world, is that you'll often have a gate as you enter the temple grounds. So Bud Sakamoto, our former president, is actually working on designing a gate that will go at the. If you come through the front of our temple, there's a sidewalk that leads up to the road. And so, right at the entrance or up at by the road, we were going to build this ceremonial gate. Funny thing though is Socho Aoki somehow got word that we were building this, and somehow, and I don't know how it got out. I don't know who was saying it, but they confused it with the Shinto Tori. Tori is also a gate that the Shinto shrines have. And so Aoki Sensei Socho was asking me, said, "Are you guys putting up a torii at the Houston Temple?" So I had to correct him that no, we are trying to develop building a gate, which is very traditional in all the temples in Japan. So, anyways, the focus of this study session, as with all the previous study sessions, is to listen and pick up from the Dharma. So, as I mentioned before, we get into very specifics, just a little bit of a review, and I'm going to try to go through this very quickly because it is a review, and I hope that most of you remember a lot of it. But of course, we do know that the founder of Buddhism, it was Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni Buddha, as he became known once he attained enlightenment. And so, what you have in your sheets in front of you is an outline of what we're hoping to do. So, um, this session and the next session will be basically, if I could do it all in one session, that would be great. But quickly going over the historical Buddha, and also how Buddhism was spread following his passing, and including the development of what we call Mahayana Buddhism. So a good point here is, then let's start off with the Buddha himself. So in Japanese, when we talk about Buddhism, um, maybe I'll ask Junichi-san, Hashimoto-san, what in Japanese, how do we say Buddhism? You have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
仏教、
Bukkyo. Okay, Bukkyo is two words. Butsu is Buddha. Kyo is teaching. Okay, so Buddha teaching. It can mean several things. It can mean the teaching of the Buddha, but it can also mean the teaching that leads you to become a Buddha. Okay? So this, just by the implication of this word, makes it very different from other religions, particularly faith-based religions that where you believe in a supreme being, say, because, for instance, in Christianity, no matter how hard you try, you cannot be a God, because just the definition through Christianity. However, the goal of Buddhism is to become a Buddha, so becoming an enlightened being, right? And that is what the Buddha taught throughout his life, how one can also attain this enlightenment, the enlightenment that he attained at the age of 35. So we know that, of course, the Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama in a kingdom called Kapilavastu, and he was raised in a very sheltered lifestyle. Um, uh, when he was born, there was a prophet that by the name of Ashita, and Ashita stated that, should this infant grow up to become the ruler of the land, he will be a wise and just ruler. But should he forego his kingdom, he could be truly a leader of all mankind. So, of course, his father, King Suddhodana, wanted the heir to the throne, so he made sure that Siddhartha led a very sheltered life. That being said, there are events throughout his life that made him reflect deeply on the dukkha, or the sufferings of life. We know, of course, Queen Maya, Siddhartha's mother, passed away about a week after she gave birth to him. Most likely complications from childbirth. And so, of course, just with his birth, there's death that's associated directly. So, Siddhartha, till the age of 29, he led a very sheltered life. But at the age of 29, he finally decides that he needs to leave this kingdom, and goes in search of what we call the truth. And so for 6 years, he does what we call these ascetic practices. And I've listed on there, I believe. I think it's like the third page. Um, Basically, the 6 years of extreme ascetic practices, practicing including things like fasting, no liquid intake, and of course, I mentioned before, no breathing as one of the practices. So very difficult ascetic practices, but he finds that that wasn't the way to enlightenment. So after 6 years of doing that, he forgoes ascetic practices. He receives a rice gruel from a maiden by the name of Sujata, and he then regains his strength. The other 5 mendicants thinks he's given in, and of course they leave him and they go on their way. Um, but he would come to see them again uh, very soon, actually. So after he's left by himself, he spends 49 days under the Bodhi tree, where he meditates, and he then awakens to enlightenment. And during this period, he begins to see things as they truly are. And there's different processes that occur to the Buddha, including knowledge of former lives, uh, knowledge of the birth and deaths of beings, and knowledge of casting off ignorance, which had bound him to the cycle of birth and death. And he also begins then to develop the Buddhist ideals, and including he receives the wisdom and understanding of the mechanics of the 12 um, dependent origination, 12 links of dependent origination that perpetuates the cycle of life and death. And then after attaining that enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and this is in a place called Bodh Gaya, he spends a while contemplating on it and enjoying actually the enlightenment that he had found. Uh, but ultimately, he realizes that he needs to share what he had attained, and so he goes to teach the Buddha's teaching. And so the very first one of his teachings, we call it the turning of the wheel of Dharma. And so he begins by thinking of who he's going to share this teaching with. And he then decides the 5 mendicants who had left him would be excellent individuals to learn this Dharma. And so he seeks them out, and they're at a place called Deer Park of Isipatana, which is in a place called Sarna. And there he gives his first of the first teachings, which is called the Four Noble Truths. And you're all familiar with the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, dukkha, and the goal of Buddhism, first of all, is understanding that there is suffering in life. But then the object of the teachings is how do we relieve ourselves from that suffering. So, in order to do that, he says first we need to seek out the source of our suffering. And he realizes, or he teaches, the fact that our ignorance and our attachments cause us, and our greed cause us to suffer, causation of suffering arising. So, of course, you're all quite familiar with Reverend Ken Tanaka's teachings on this. He calls it gas, right? Greed, anger, and stupidity, and those three things are the root cause of our suffering. But when we get right down to it, it is ignorance that is the cause of our suffering. And of course, the Buddha says there is a stage that goes beyond this suffering, and that is the stage of what we call nirodha or nirvana, and that's the extinguishing of suffering. And so then he then teaches about the path to that cessation of suffering, and this is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. It's called eightfold because they're all interconnected. So it's not a linear type thing. It's more of all of them affect one another, okay, simultaneously. So this then becomes the foundation or the beginning of the teachings of the Buddha. So then what we understand is that very, very early on in his teaching, the development of what we call the Sangha, the brotherhood, the monkhood is developed. Okay? So Buddhism was then mainly for those who belong to the Sangha. Okay? So if you wanted to follow the Buddhist path, you had to become a member of the Sangha. This is very important for us because what it means is that the teachings then uh, become, or they emphasize the uh, the need for practice. Okay, so through practice, one can then gain the goals that the Buddha attained, which is enlightenment. Okay, so you have your teachings, the teachings of the Buddha, and you have the practices that go along with that, and ultimately then leading one to enlightenment. Okay. So as Buddhism develops, then what you begin to see is the different schools of Buddhism are basically their differences in how they practice those teachings. Okay? Ultimately, wanting to get to that same goal of enlightenment, but it's basically in this particular school we have this kind of practice. In that particular school, we have this kind of practice. Okay, so these are different practices to attain that same summit, if you will, the peak of the teachings, which is enlightenment. So the Buddha taught about realities and what we call the Dharma seals, the three seals of Buddhism, seals making the teachings unique to it, making it a unique teaching. And the three basic Dharma seals that all schools of Buddhism understand is first that all phenomenal events are brought about through causes and circumstances. And so when those causes and circumstances change, then the phenomenal event will naturally change. When those causes and circumstances cease to be, then that phenomenal event also ceases to be. Okay, so that is the first of the seals that talking about impermanence, that everything is in a constant flux, right? Um, I I go weekly or try to go weekly once a week with my uncle we go out golfing on a regular basis. And my game is in a constant flux. I can have one good shot, but the very next shot can be a very poor shot. Okay, it's always changing. Okay, and so our lives are basically like this. It's always constantly changing. And we all know this. Some days you wake up and you feel good about yourself physically. Other days you might get up and you might have slept the wrong way or whatever, and you're not feeling, but constantly changing. Of course, this change is neither good nor bad. It's just a fact, right? Some changes we like, some changes we really look forward to, and other changes are the more difficult ones that we have difficulty accepting. Of course, the changes of old age and old age sickness, and of course, death. These are changes that all of us um, have anxiety with. And the fact that as I look out at the people who are attending this lecture, I think it is on all of your minds, including myself. I think Sam's probably the youngest one here. Uh, he's an anomaly in this group because he's still in his 30s, 20s, 20s. So Sam is in his 20s, which is very young. But for the majority of us, we do know uh, of uh, com- our equals who have passed on, and the longer you live, the more partings you're going to have, right? That's just a natural thing of life. But as I was mentioning, this change, some changes we are very happy with, others we have difficulty with. But change is neither good nor bad. It is just a fact of life. He also, another of the seals is that there is no such thing as an independent self. Okay, independent, unchanging self. This was one of the truths that garnered some misunderstanding in the West on the teachings of Buddhism, because in some of the translations you'll see it as that there is Buddhism does not believe in a soul. Okay, and what Buddhism doesn't believe in is a ever unchanging entity. Uh, so if you call that the soul that's unchanging, then Buddhism won't believe in that. It doesn't mean that Buddhism uh, doesn't acknowledge the existence of beings, but they are constantly changing. So, our consciousness, our um, emotions, all that is constantly changing throughout our lives, and it will continue to change once we pass on. But it doesn't necessarily mean, uh, it just means that we don't believe in a static self. Okay, there is a recognition of self, but it's also a phenomenal event. So it will change as well. Okay. And then finally, that the Buddha realized that there is a state of equanimity or tranquility, which he called nirvana or enlightenment. Uh, are there any questions up until this point? Pretty straightforward, right? So throughout his life, then the Buddha went and taught how one can attain enlightenment. So people wanted to also uh, attain the same state that this individual awoke to. So this is also something that is very unique about Buddhism, is that we look at the Buddha as a human being. He's not a supreme being, or isn't this. They do say he's a manifestation, but we're all manifestations of the truth. So He is one manifestation of the truth that helps guide us to see things in a much greater sense than our individual lives. And so, again, he was a human being just like everybody else, who was awakened to this enlightenment, and it's his teachings then that he spread. And of course, there are some major sites in India where he spread these teachings, and one of them is known as the Rajagrihar, or Vulture's Peak. And there is said that he expounded many different sutras or teachings, including what we call the Lotus Sutra, the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, the largest sutra on Amida, and the Contemplation Sutra on Amida. These are in particularly they're particular importance to the Mahayana school of Buddhism. And then there's a place called Shravasti where he spent about 25 years during the rainy season doing special retreats. And there's a place called the Jeta Grove, and there are many legends that are associated with that. And for us in Pure Land School, the Shravasti was a place where the smaller Skavati Vyuha Sutra or the Amida Kyo was taught at this location. Some other places are also listed there. Nalanda, which has one of the oldest universities in the world, Nalanda College. There's just the footprints of where that college was, but it was known as one of the oldest centers of education. Vaishali, where the first where women were first uh, accepted into the Sangha. Buddha's foster mother, or yeah, his real mother, Maya's sister. Her name was Mahaprajapati, and she raised Siddhartha from infancy, and she becomes the first female to enter the Sangha, along with 500 women from the Shaka clan. And so, and this is also where it was said that the Buddha gave his last discourse to a large audience. This is where the Nirvana Sutra is said to have been taught. And from there, then the Shakyamuni moved on to Kushinagara, where he passed away, entering what we know as Parinirvana, or perfect enlightenment. So after he passed away, then we have the development of Buddhism over the centuries. The first 100 years we know as the sort of a fundamental Buddhism, and this was a period when the teachings remained fairly intact. You have direct disciples of the Buddha still present, and so this period, basically, the teachings remain exactly as the Buddha taught. But over time, things begin to change, and you begin to see shifts in philosophies and thoughts of those following the Buddha. Some were very strict, believing you have to do exactly as the Buddha taught. But there are others who are a little bit more liberal in their way of thinking, thinking ultimately that if the goal of Buddhism is to release one from suffering, then that should be the focus, and not necessarily adhering to a practice that might be outdated, okay, or not in not keeping with the times. And a good example of this, of course, would be when we look at the example of women in Buddhism. So even in the Pure Land school, um, in the 48 vows of Amida Buddha, the 35th vow states that all women will not be born into Pure Land in the form of a woman, but will be reborn in the form of a man. And if that doesn't happen, then he will not attain enlightenment. Okay, of course, um, when we go back to the time of the historical Buddha, it was very much male male oriented society, and Asia today still, I would say, is much more skewed in that direction. So that today, of course, in our society, that would be a very outdated uh, teaching or passage. And so we then look at that and say, how do we interpret or how do we understand this? Okay. And of course, one of the things that we do understand is that the Buddha, in his teachings, is talking about equality and equanimity. And in that time period, of course, being born as a woman um, in the Pure Land would mean that you're still of a lower grade of being. Um, that sounds discriminatory. It was viewed that the women were of a lower grade. Okay, um, so to try to offset that, to say that there is no such thing as a lower grade in the Pure Land. But again, in this day and age, we would probably not even say that. Uh, that you know, as we are actually, to be honest, when we attain enlightenment or when we enter into nirvana, then there is no really male or female because all beings are become equal. Okay? So gender then no longer becomes an issue. Um, and perhaps maybe our society is going in that direction as we see today how our gender identities have changed over this past 10 to 20 years, um, where 20 years ago you didn't have LGBTQ2 plus. There was no identification of these things, but today we do have them, and it is because they're understanding the equality of all beings. And so just as everything else, the teachings also uh, are not static. They will change as well. So the Buddha would have no problems in us saying, this language may not be appropriate for this day and age. He would probably be the first to say it's natural that it changes. Okay? So, anyways, I'm sorry I got off a little bit of tangent there. So, as the teachings develop after the Buddha passed away, we get the development of different schools or different branches of Buddhism. And of course, we have two major branches, the Theravada, the way of the elders, and this tends to be the Southern Buddhism. Um, and there is a terminology, Hinayana, which we don't really refer to it. Again, here's another example of change. There was a word called Hinayana, which was a name that was coined by the Mahayana school. Hinayana means smaller vehicle, and Mahayana means larger vehicle. You can understand why they don't use those terminologies anymore. We call it Theravada, which means the way of the elders, and they tend to be the more orthodox, following the practices very rigidly. And the Mahayana is the more liberal group. They went back to the ideals if it's Buddhism is to release one from suffering, then the goal of all Buddhists was to help all beings release themselves from suffering. And in order to do that, particularly within the Mahayana school, temples and and schools were developed to help the community, much more so. And so as this developed, um, the whole culture of Mahayana Buddhism, which is seen mainly in the northern parts of Asia, China, Korea, Japan, develops. And a third one is the Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism, which is more of a tantric, and it's a esoteric Buddhism. And you see this in Tibet, northern India, Nepal, Bhutan, Mongolia, and there are some schools in Japan, particularly the Mikkyo, which is to do, um, as I said, with esoteric Buddhism, and they have their own unique lineage. So when we look at the development of Mahayana Buddhism, as I mentioned, it was after a period of time, as Buddhism, after following the passing of the Buddha, for number of centuries, they carried on the practice exactly as was taught by the Buddha. The problem you had with this is that when the Buddha was alive as an enlightened being, if you had an issue with, say, a practice, you could just go up to the Buddha and he would guide you as to uh, how one should practice. The problem is once the Buddha passed away, then you're getting guidance from individuals who may not be enlightened as well. And so there was a greater focus on the structure and organization than anything else. And as that became really focused, there were people that felt, wait a minute, maybe we're losing sight of what is truly important in Buddhism, and that is to relieve the beings from suffering. And so then there was a whole different school that began to develop, and they started looking at things in a much different way. And along that same timeline, you begin to see how Buddhism itself changes. So when we see right after the passing of the Buddha, if you look at reliefs, carvings, images of the Buddha, they were, when the Buddha was alive, he forbade people from making images or carvings of himself because he didn't believe in idol worshiping. Okay? So while the Buddha was alive, to signify the where the Buddha was, they had the footprints of the Buddha. Right? It was what how they identified him. But when he passed away, of course, they started telling the story of the Buddha. And along with telling the story of the Buddha, you begin to see artwork that develops congruent to that. So um, originally, the Buddha, being a human being, is the same size as everybody else. But over time, of course, he becomes deified and he gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the same time, then he becomes this supra being, if you will. And so it was more to do with out of respect and honoring the enlightenment itself, that you begin to see the many different Buddhas become developed or taught of in the teachings. And as they develop this idea, the idea of three Dharma bodies becomes very prevalent. So what we call the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. Okay, so Dharmakaya has neither has shape nor form. It is the Dharma. Um, using pop culture reference, it is the matrix. It is all around us, but we can't really see it or feel it. Okay. Um, yeah, there are many, including myself, that sees a lot of Buddhism in the Matrix itself. But so, anyways, Dharmakaya has no form or shape. It's all around us. It is the Dharma. In Japanese, we call it whole. Okay, and it's very difficult for us to conceptualize as individuals. Then from that Dharmakaya, you have the development of what we call Sambhogakaya. Sambhogakaya is the manifestation of Dharmakaya. Uh, it is said in Buddhism that this Dharmakaya itself, even though it has no form nor shape, it has to express itself. Okay, and this is what we call the compassion. Um, it has to express itself so that those who are ignorant can understand or at least get the idea that there is something there. And so it manifests itself first as what we call Sambhogakaya. And these Sambhogakayas, they're what we call sacred stories or sacred beings. They don't necessarily exist in our historical timeline, but they tell us of a greater truth that exists. And so Amida Buddha is one of those uh, Sambhogakaya. The Vairocana Buddha is another Sambhogakaya. Usually with the Sambhogakayas, they have a beginning. So there's usually a storyline that is told about these individuals or this manifestation. So they'll have a beginning, but they don't have an end. So um, with Amida, for instance, this past Sunday, as we chanted the Amida Sutra here at our service, it says specifically in the Amida Sutra that in this very present moment, in 10, 10 kalpas away from us, uh, is a land called Skavati Vyuha, which is the uh, Amida's Pure Land. And Amida in this present moment is expounding the teachings in this Pure Land. So the idea of Amida, there's a whole story of how he becomes Amida Buddha, but there is no ending. He there's no you won't find anywhere in the liturgy of the passing of Amida Buddha. Okay, so because this is Amida Buddha is a manifestation of the truth. It's helping us try to understand something greater than our physical existence. And finally, you have the third body, Dharma body, called Nirmanakaya. And we traditionally look at that as a historical Buddha. It takes form and shape. It has a beginning, has a specific end, but it is there to expound the greater truth or the Dharma so that beings can liberate themselves from our existence of suffering. So this then becomes the impetus when these three dharma bodies becomes more broadly accepted. Then the development of Mahayana really takes off because you're talking about many different manifestations of the Dharma to express the truth, including, of course, within ourselves, Pure Land Buddhism. Now, as Pure Land Buddhism develops, so it's very unique in that we're talking specifically about Amida Buddha and all the various sutras or teachings that expound or talk about Amida Buddha. But this idea of Pure Land Buddhism was not a major component of Buddhism at the beginning. Because at the beginning, the major ideal was to attain enlightenment in this life through your practice. So one would join the Sangha with a goal of becoming enlightened. So this idea of Amida Buddha was a very minor part of Buddhism until the development of Mahayana Buddhism uh, took took place, and that's where it really begins to develop. So I'm going to leave off there for tonight. What I would like to continue on next time is talking about specifically the our lineage, Pure Land Buddhism, and how the what we call the seven patriarchs bring it down to Shinran Shoni, and then also understanding a little bit of the differences that these seven patriarchs, um, even though they talk about Pure Land Buddhism and we talk about it being an easy path um, for the vast, large portion of Pure Land Buddhism, it is still seen to be very much a teaching for monastics. Okay, so for the Sangha, it wasn't a teaching that was necessarily for lay individuals. And this is where uh, we have to sort of see the differences between the seven patriarchs and when we get down to Honen Shoni and Shinan Shoni. So up until that time, they were still talking about different ways of practice to attain enlightenment. Okay? And although we call it the easy path, it was still a practice that they're talking about. And I'll talk more about that next time. Um, so this was a very brief, quick review of things that we talked about before. Karen, you had a couple questions that you emailed me, and I wanted to address that. Do you remember what I remember the one about the Dalai Lama, but what was the other one that you had asked me?
Thank you, Sensei. It was about the age of Mappo.
Oh, yes, age of Mappo. So the cosmology of Buddhism, they talk about the different ages. So usually when we talk about Mappo, the last Dharma age, it's said, first of all, that the first 500 years is what we call the right Dharma age. Okay, first 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
And right Dharma age is a period where it's said that the teachings exist, there are those who practice those teachings, and also they attain enlightenment through those practices. So that's the first 500 years, known as the right Dharma age. Okay. Then the next 1,000 years is generally seen as what we call the semblance Dharma age. Semblance means that they're going through the motion, but so the teachings exist and there's practitioners who are going through the motion, but because they sort of lost focus on the true meaning of the teachings, they're just going through the motion. Very few attain enlightenment. So this is a period where you see a large development of many temples being built, and the structure is becoming focused more than the teaching itself. So this is called the semblance Dharma age. And then the Mappo, in many understandings, it's for the next 10,000 years. I think you said 1,000 year in your email, but it's actually usually understood as 10,000 years.
Oh.
So this period is a period of where the secular world comes into place. So people are moving away from organized religion, and so that there's still the teachings still exist, but now you have very few individuals who are following those teachings, and of course, next to none attain enlightenment. Okay, so that's a Mappo. And then at the very end of that Mappo period, 10,000 year, we call it Homitsu, the decline of Buddhism. And what it means is that the period of this Dharma comes to an end. But it doesn't mean everything stops there. It said that there will be the next Buddha that comes out at that time. And that is Maitreya Bodhisattva. Miroku Bosatsu in Japanese is supposed to be the next Buddha. Okay, so when this Dharma age, the Dharma period comes to an end in 10,000 years, at that time, the next Buddha will come into this world. So for people like Shinran Shonin, if you look at when Buddhism was developed, we say roughly 2,500 years ago was when the historical Buddha was alive. And so for the first 500 years, so basically up to the birth of Christ, is seen to be the right Dharma age. And then for the next 1,000 years was the semblance Dharma age. And so when you think of when Shinran was born, 1172, 1173, 1172, 1172, that would have been right after that 1,000-year period, right? 1172. So after AD. So for Shinran, he understood himself as being right in the beginning of Mappo. And during this Mappo period, it was believed that really the only teaching that could help us attain release from suffering was through Amida, or the Pure Land Buddhism. Okay, this is according to Shinran's understanding. Okay? And this is also why in Shinran's writings, you'll find numerous passages. Maybe I'll bring it, if I remember, I'll try to bring it out for next week. But you'll find numerous passages where they say those who follow the Nembutsu teachings are equal to the Maitreya Bodhisattva. And what they're referring to there is that those who follow the Nembutsu teachings in their next existence will ultimately attain enlightenment. See, if Maitreya is supposed to be the next Buddha, right? So those Nembutsu followers, the followers of the Nembutsu teaching, become equal to Maitreya. That means at the end of this life, they too will attain enlightenment. Okay? And we could get into that more. Now, the second question that Karen had, does that answer your?
Yes, thank you, Sensei.
And the second question Karen had mentioned was about the Dalai Lama stating that he doesn't think he'll come back again. Is that what it was?
Yes. He says
Okay.
he won't be reincarnating.
He won't be reincarnating, but it's an interesting message, because in fact the historical Buddha stated that once he attained enlightenment, that he would not come back as an incarnation, and that is to say that once we awaken, or once we become enlightened, there is no need to keep on coming back. Now, I don't believe that's what the Dalai Lama was alluding to when he said this. I think he was very saddened to see the state of the world, and so saying that I won't come back. But I'm not exactly sure of where he's coming from that for that. Um, Rose, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Sensei. My understanding, and I read this quite a while ago, really, in the time about this, when it was stated that the Dalai Lama had said that. And so much was because of, as we know, China has very active in that area, and that's why the Dalai Lama is where he is now.
Right.
Part of it was they have said that, well, they have the next Dalai Lama.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So the Dalai Lama was said to be, well, if they do, it isn't going to be him because of how things would go. But I understood that there was already um, I'm going to say a child, a young person that very well may be who the Tibetan away from Tibet are I don't know I'm going to say the word anointed, but that's not right. But I just thought that was rather interesting because how events how events move everything along, causes and conditions. How do things change? What are the challenges in change? And are we as human beings the architects of all of that? Isn't it fascinating to see that even at these higher spiritual existences, there's a dilemma? And so how it would be looked at as one goes forward. It just fascinates me because isn't that the way of human beings?
Well, and I think one thing that we in the West don't really see that much is that, in fact, even in the Tibetan Buddhism, um, there's a lot of politics involved as well. So the Dalai Lama is of one lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. He comes from the Yellow Hats, um, but there are other lineages as well. And so, yeah, it is interesting, and it can also be a little bit uh, difficult for all of us, especially here in the West, as Buddhism is introduced to the West. Uh, it's hard for many of us to um, look at the history and surmise what is true and what is real. And the reason why I say this is that there are schools or schools of Buddhism that are introduced here in the West who that have sort of taken some um, foothold in the West, but for instance, in Japan, they would be observed as almost like cults. But because we don't have that background knowledge here in the West, we think, oh, this is another form of Buddhism. It's an accepted form of Buddhism. There was recently there was an incident that happened at the Manitoba Buddhist Temple. Uh, you may have seen, and I've seen it in on various hikes that I've gone on. There are these white posts that say it's for world peace. I don't know if you've seen those posts. There's usually some Japanese written on one side, and then there's I can't something to do with world peace, and that's actually a cult in Japan that started this movement, and yet it's gotten traction in the fact that a lot of people, you do see it at various places, and so um, the Manitoba Buddhist Temple, without knowing the background, they actually um, got one of those posts put on their temple grounds. And so Socho Aoki had quite a difficulty explaining why that might not be the best thing to have there. And that happens with other forms of Buddhism. There are other schools here that are, well, they're now recognized even in Japan, but they're seen to be new schools. And at one point, they were seen to be almost cultish. And one of them is the, well, maybe I shouldn't go into it, but I think the difficulty in the West is when we see introduction of different various schools, it's very easy for us to say, oh, that's just another form of Buddhism without seeing the background of how it was developed in that country. And so it is, I think, important for us to try to be knowledgeable of the history and background. Yeah. I don't know if I made any sense there. So anyways, does anybody have any other comments or questions at this time? If not, we'll go on from next week and we'll talk more about these 7 great masters. And then we'll get right into Shinran and then the Tanisho. In particular, the emphasis is on what we call the 5 doctrinal pillars of Jodo Shinshu and why these are important for us to understand Shinran's teachings. So that's what I wanted to focus on during these lectures. So we will have lectures leading up till the 19th, was it 19th or 20th of December? Anyways, I've sent it in your email, so you have all the dates. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sensei.
Thank you very much.